In 2021, Russian pipeline gas supplied roughly 40% of European Union gas imports. Within about 2 years that share had collapsed to a fraction of it. Almost nobody predicted that. The consensus assumption, held on both sides, was that the dependence was structural and would take a decade to unwind if it could be unwound at all. So the interesting question is not whether Europe replaced Russian gas. It did. The question is what the replacement actually was, and my argument is that Europe did not eliminate a dependency, it exchanged one dependency for a different and less discussed set of them, and paid for the transition in industrial capacity it has not recovered. By the end you will be able to see exactly where the new exposure sits. This matters directly to the dependency thesis running through this series. If a wealthy bloc can shed a 40% energy dependency in 2 years, then dependencies are more reversible than my earlier arguments implied, and my claim that Russia is locked into China deserves a harder look. So this video is partly a stress test of my own position. If Europe could exit, why can't Russia? There is also a practical read. Europe's energy security is now built on a set of assumptions that are rarely stated out loud, and it is worth knowing what they are. The dependence was built deliberately over 50 years, starting with Soviet-era gas deals in the 1970s, and it was considered a success by both parties for most of that time. The logic was mutual hostage-taking in the stabilizing sense. Russia needed the revenue, Europe needed the molecules, and neither could easily walk away. Interdependence as peace policy. German industry in particular built its competitiveness partly on cheap, reliable pipeline gas, chemicals, fertilizer, glass, metals. These are sectors where energy is not overhead, it is the input. That is the specific thing to hold on to. The dependency was not primarily about heating homes. It was about industrial processes with no cheap substitute. So how did the replacement actually happen? 3 mechanisms, and only one of them is the one usually cited. The first is LNG, and Europe moved impressively fast, chartering floating regasification units and standing up import capacity in months rather than the usual years. Germany built terminals at a speed that surprised its own planners. The second is demand destruction, and this is the part that gets less attention because it is not a success story. A meaningful share of the gap was closed not by finding new gas but by using less, and much of that reduction came from energy-intensive industry cutting output or shutting down. European ammonia and fertilizer production fell sharply. Aluminium and zinc smelters curtailed. Some of that capacity came back when prices eased. Some of it did not, and some relocated permanently. That is a real cost and it is often folded into the success narrative. Replacing gas by no longer running the factory that used it is a genuine adjustment, but it is not substitution. The third mechanism was luck. 2 consecutive mild winters reduced heating demand at exactly the right moment. Storage refilled. That was not policy. Now the second pillar, what the new dependency looks like. Europe's LNG comes substantially from the United States, Qatar, and a set of smaller suppliers. That is more diversified than a single pipeline network, genuinely an improvement in supplier count. But LNG is a globally traded commodity priced on a global market. Pipeline gas was priced on long-term contracts largely insulated from Asian demand. Now European buyers compete directly with Japanese, Korean, and Chinese buyers for the same cargoes. That means Europe's energy prices are now coupled to Asian economic conditions in a way they never were. A cold winter in Northeast Asia is now a European price event. And the delivery mechanism is maritime. Which brings us back to a theme from earlier in this series: LNG cargoes cross the same choke points everyone else's do. Europe traded a fixed pipeline exposure to one supplier for a seaborne exposure to global market conditions and shipping routes. There is also a duration question. Much of the new supply is contracted on long-term deals stretching decades, which secures volume and locks in demand for a fuel Europe's own climate policy intends to phase down. That tension is unresolved. The fourth mechanism is the one that will shape the next decade rather than the last 2 years, what the switch did to European electricity prices, and therefore to everything built on them. Most European power markets price electricity on marginal cost, which for much of the day means the cost of running a gas plant. So the gas price does not just affect gas users. It sets the electricity price for everyone, including industries that burned no gas at all. That is why the shock spread far beyond chemicals and fertilizer. Aluminium smelting, for instance, is fundamentally a process for converting electricity into metal. A smelter does not care where the power came from, it cares what a megawatt-hour costs. And here the timing matters. The gas switch happened while Europe was also retiring nuclear and coal capacity on climate and political grounds, which raised the share of hours where gas set the price. So the same decision looks different at different time horizons. In the short run, replacing the molecules was the whole problem and Europe solved it. In the long run, the binding constraint is the price of electricity relative to competitors, and the United States, with domestic gas, and China, with subsidized coal and enormous renewable build-out, both hold a structural advantage that the LNG switch did not close and arguably widened. That is the mechanism converting a 2-year energy emergency into a decade-long competitiveness question. It is not a story about Russia at all anymore, which is precisely why it gets so little attention. The fifth mechanism is the one that will determine whether the switch actually holds, storage, and what it costs to keep full. Pipeline supply is continuous. It arrives at a steady rate whether demand is high or low, which means the system needs relatively little buffer. LNG arrives in discrete cargoes. Each one is a decision by a seller who could have sent it to Asia instead. So a system running on LNG needs substantially more storage to bridge the gaps between deliveries, and it has to fill that storage during summer at whatever price the global market demands. Europe responded by mandating minimum storage levels ahead of winter. That was prudent policy and it worked. It also created a large, predictable, price-insensitive buyer that shows up every summer, which suppliers can see coming. The result is a structural summer premium that did not exist under long-term pipeline contracts. Europe now pays to be safe, every year, as a standing cost rather than a crisis cost. And storage is finite. It covers weeks of severe cold, not a season of supply disruption. It converts a catastrophic risk into an expensive one, which is a genuine achievement and not the same as removing it. That is why I keep returning to the mild winters. They were not a footnote. They were the margin that let the transition happen without the storage system being tested at its limit, and nobody has yet seen what a genuinely hard winter does to this configuration. The strongest objection is that I am measuring the wrong thing, and it is a good objection. It goes like this. Comparing pipeline dependence on a single hostile supplier to exposure to a diversified global commodity market is a category error. Diversified market exposure is what normal energy security looks like. Every other major economy lives with it. The relevant risk is not price volatility, it is coercion, and Europe removed the coercion risk almost entirely. Prices go up and down. A supplier turning off a valve to extract political concessions is a different class of problem, and that class is now gone. Add that the transition accelerated renewable build-out by years, and the picture is a block that took a painful but successful shock. I think that is largely right, and I want to be explicit, on the coercion measure, Europe clearly won. Trading a hostage relationship for market exposure is a good trade, and I would make it again. Where I would push back is on treating the industrial losses as transition costs that have been paid. Some of those plants are gone, and the capacity relocated to places with cheaper energy, including the United States and China. That is not a price spike. It is a permanent shift in where things get made. So both things are true, Europe removed a coercion risk, and Europe permanently ceded industrial capacity to do it. The success framing keeps only the first half. What follows from this? First, for the running thesis, yes, dependencies can be broken faster than expected, but the conditions matter. Europe had wealth, alternative suppliers competing for its business, a liquid global market for the substitute, and 2 mild winters. Russia selling into an Asian market with one large buyer has none of those. The Europe case doesn't rescue Russia, if anything it clarifies why Russia's position is harder. Second, watch Asian demand as a European price indicator. That coupling is new and is not yet in most people's mental model. Third, the industrial question is the live one. If energy-intensive manufacturing continues to leave, that is a slower and larger strategic change than the gas switch itself, and it will be discussed as an industrial policy failure rather than as the delayed cost of an energy decision. So my read, a real and impressive achievement on the coercion dimension, achieved partly through capability, partly through demand destruction that carried permanent costs, and partly through weather. Europe is safer from being squeezed and more exposed to a global market it does not control. Whether that is a good trade depends entirely on which risk you are more worried about, and reasonable people weigh those differently. If you think the industrial capacity loss is overstated, or that it would have happened anyway on cost grounds, that is the argument I most want to see in the comments. It is the part of my own case I hold least firmly. Next, what all of this means for who actually sets prices in the new energy map.